Hi, I'm Mark Hummel, and welcome to Mark Hummel's Harmonica Party. I'm here with Jeff Vargin, and we are going to be talking about all things blues, harmonica, all kinds of subjects. We're going to get into all kinds of things on this show, and I think today I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about just, I want to definitely talk about my friend James Harman, who just passed away a week ago yesterday. And we're planning on, I'm hoping we can air this on his birthday, which is June 8th.
Yeah, well, the viewers will know.
Yes,
the viewers will know if it's June 8th.
Then you know it's James Harman's birthday.
Then you know it's James Harman's birthday. Yeah.
But what I would like to just kind of start off this episode, since this is the very first episode we're doing, and you kind of suggested this as an idea, and that is just a lot of the controversies that are going on in the blues world at the moment. And a lot of it, has to do with Black Lives Matter and whites and blacks and blues music and this whole conversation. And I guess what I wanted to get into a little bit is just the whole situation, how, blues is from the South. It's African American music. It's something that all of the white blues musicians that play it have adopted. They don't have ownership to it. And I think it's important to state that when you're talking about blues music, because it comes out of black people's hardships. And those of us whites that got into it in my generation and the generation before, because really the generation before mine was probably the first generation of blues artists that were white that adopted black blues, and that would be the 60s, a lot of the 60s blues people out of Chicago and places like that. Prior to that, there was a lot of white musicians that were playing jazz and had relationships with a lot of the older jazz musicians that were black people, like Louis Armstrong and Sidney Bechet and all these artists that got discovered and then brought over to Europe. And so Big Bill Brunzi, there's so many people that have been, there's always been a real cross-pollination in the South. And I think that's kind of what I wanted to get into, is the whole culture of the South that kind of both created blues and also kind of put certain dividing lines in there.
Where does the British invasion come into all this? When did the Stones? All these
you're getting way ahead of us.
I'm way ahead. Okay,
you're
all right.
Way
so
ahead.
You're
way ahead of us now. Yeah,
because
I wanted to go way back to the early 20th century.
Well, let's hear about the 20th century and how these guys transitioned from. Were they playing the Chitlin circuit? Is that what they were playing back then? The old blues musicians? Black
music was always in a very segregated kind of format. From the time of its inception, it was in the South. There was, that's where they had, ropes and stuff in the theater that would divide up the white part of the theater from the where the black folks sat. So there's always been this kind of segregation coming from the white officials, and it was really both white musicians and black musicians that kind of got rid of that, I guess would be the best way to put it. But one of the things I was talking to my friend Nathan James, who actually played with James Harman for 23 years, is we were talking about we were talking about James. I was also telling him, about the very first time that I played down south was in the mid '80s. This was like 1986, and what a shock it was to go down there and play in the Deep South. And things are different now, but Tell me,
what does it mean to be shocked? What is a shock?
I'm just saying, having, played in clubs in California and the Northeast, you'd have black people and white people coming into the clubs. In the South, it's not like that. When you play on Beale Street, it would be either a black audience or it would be a white audience, but it was like most cities you would go to, except for maybe New Orleans. Well, Memphis actually was a little bit integrated too. New Orleans always seems to be more integrated than some of the other cities. But if you went in the sticks, or you went to even cities like Jackson, Mississippi, that wasn't the case.
Was there a time when as a white blues player, you could not play black clubs? And black blues players could not play white clubs when you were coming through?
When I was coming up, because I started playing when I moved up here in 1974. I started playing really mainly in black clubs because that was really the only place you could play blues. If you weren't working the Fillmore Auditorium, which very few players of that were local could play at, then you were playing in black blues joints with a lot of black musicians, and there were a few white musicians that were going into those clubs, but it wasn't. It was still a pretty much of an anomaly compared to it was closer to how it was, say, in Chicago in the 60s. By the early 70s, it was kind of a similar situation here. So I could play out in places like North Richmond, or I could play in places like Oakland, or, like people would go, a few white musicians would play in Hunters Point, places like that. But it was still very, very much kind of a segregated thing. But black folks were much more welcoming. I remember the first time I played at a black club, it was like I was blown away with how nice people were to me, even though, if a black person had gone to a white country and Western club, they wouldn't have been welcomed at all. And that's what kind of blew me away about the difference between the way the black blues audience behaved and the way the white people behaved. And so that always just shocked me. And things changed over the next 20 years considerably, mainly because a lot of the older folks that were going to blues gigs just got too old to go out. And now it's kind of like you got that with white people. White people are getting too old to go out because it's people my age and older. And so you have a really different kind of scene now, and the fact that most of the first generation electric giants are gone. I mean, the elders of the blues, people like T-Bone Walker, Muddy Waters, or even James Cotton now, and so many other, B.B. King. All these people have passed away. And so essentially you only have a few black musicians that are playing the blues. There is a new generation coming along, and there's some people that I've really enjoyed, listening to, like Quan Willis and Marquise Knox and a few others, Andrew Ali, who's a great harp player out of Richmond, Virginia. But it's still, comparatively, it's much more of a white musician-dominated world. And so that's caused a lot of, strange kind of feelings, I think, among, a lot of the African-American musicians, because, there's this thing of, like, if you start thinking that, blues started with Stevie Ray Vaughan, it didn't.
Right.
If you start thinking it started with the Rolling Stones, it didn't. It goes way back. It's, all these greats that recorded and that got all of the people of my generation into the music in the first place. When I first started, it was like, these guys were gods, and I still feel that way. I mean, the first time I went to, music clubs down in Los Angeles when I was like, 15, 16 years old, I was going to see James Cotton or Sonny Terry and Brownie McGee or, B.B. King or Muddy Waters, Jimmy Rogers, all these different artists that were, Jimmy Witherspoon, that were playing in clubs in Los Angeles.
So why do you think that blues sort of stayed in that lane? Was it that the big record companies were not signing blues artists, or
they kind of never have?
It seemed like
Yeah.
B.B. King is like the name everybody knows. Whether they've heard a song or not, they've heard of B.B. King.
And the weird thing is B.B. was kind of late to the game in a lot of ways. I mean, Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf were kind of names that were out there more in the forefront, even when B.B. was still playing just primarily black nightclubs, And by 1970, he had Thrill Is Gone, which was his first really major, hit on pop radio. And that really opened a lot of doors for him. But prior to that, unfortunately, he was, like him and Bobby Bland and Little Milton, they were all kind of relegated to the Chitlin circuit. And that was, and they really didn't have the doors open that, Muddy or Howlin' Wolf or some of those artists did.
So where does James Harman fit into this?
Well,
situation?
James Harman is a generation older than me because he was 9 years older than me. He, along with people like, Charlie Musselwhite, who was out there even a little bit before James, Paul Butterfield, Mike Bloomfield, who was friends of both Butterfield and Musselwhite. There were English acts that definitely made a splash, people like Fleetwood Mac or Cream or, that's kind of, I got into the blues really kind of through the back door of the, the English rockers.
Right. And a lot of people probably wouldn't know that Fleetwood Mac started as a bluesman.
Oh, they started as bluesmen big time.
With Peter Green and that
Peter
early
Green was,
incarnation. This is before Lindsey Buckingham, before
way
Phoenix.
Before that. Far before that.
Right.
And eventually I'll do a segment on him because he's a fascinating character. But, what I wanted to say is that, people like James or, a lot of the people that are on this record, because this album, this is one called Blues Harmonica Meltdown, and this is the volume one that came out in 2000. And it's got Kim Wilson, who was with the Fabulous Thunderbirds, Rick Estrin, who was in Little Charlie and the Nightcats, James Harman, who had his own group, a guy named Gary Smith that lives down in San Jose, who was one of the early guys doing it, Billy Branch, who's one of the, generation that, he's an African American that played with Willie Dixon and a lot of other artists out of Chicago. He recorded with a lot of people out of Chicago. So, people like Robert Cray made a big splash in the 80s. Fabulous Thunderbirds, Stevie Ray Vaughan. All those acts really made a big splash because there was at the time, my age group was obviously younger. They were going out to nightclubs more. So there was a much bigger scene in the 80s and 90s in terms of nightclubs.
I was living in Southern California then, and so there was the Dynatones, the Blasters, the Fabulous Thunderbirds, Top Jimmy. There was all these sort of,
and that's kind of where that's where Harman really kind of he fit into that scene. I mean, Harman came out with this band with a guy named Hollywood Fats on guitar, another guitar player named Kid Ramos that's still alive, Willie J. Campbell on bass, Stephen Hodges, who now plays with Mavis Staples and played a lot with Tom Waits. He was the drummer. Gene Taylor, who played with the Blasters, and then, also played with James. So, I mean, all these acts and musicians are very intertwined. There was definitely, the funny thing about West Coast blues is all of us know each other. And when you go out on the road, like all of us were going out on the road, you start to get to know all the different musicians.
So when you say West Coast blues, though, now I'm getting confused about whether the blues music is West Coast or whether it is a geographical that you all live in one place? Is there a difference between Chicago blues and West Coast blues?
It's more where people live. I mean, the thing to me that's really interesting about James Harman was that he, like I say, he grew up in Anniston, Alabama. He was born in June 8th, 1946. But he kind of got into music when he was in Anniston. His father was the sheriff of Anniston, and there's some backstory to that. If you know about the civil rights bus burning that was there, but he grew up getting interested in blues because if you went literally right across the tracks from where he lived, you were in the black side of town,
right.
and
if people
there were
aren't
musicians
aware,
that were playing there that he got to see.
If people aren't aware, James Harman was white.
Yes, he was a white guy and was playing black music. And in a sense, I tend to think that was kind of a somewhat rebellious, revolutionary thing to do.
With Dad as sheriff in a small southern town.
And to be a white guy playing blues in the South, especially if you're playing with black musicians or even, going to see black musicians, that means something. So people like him or in Memphis, Charlie Musselwhite was hanging around Memphis and, going to Will Shade's house and learning to play guitar and, who's the other guy? Furry Lewis, people like that. Charlie moved to Chicago and got to know all the musicians there just by accident, really. So a lot of times, the blues was such a part of the culture that you kind of couldn't help running into it, if that makes any sense. It was just like the fabric of the culture. I mean, whether you were black or white, you were going to hear blues on the radio. You're going to hear it coming out of, people's houses or whatever. And so that's the interesting thing to me about the South was that it really was a fabric of life down there. And I think that's where James or Charlie or my friend Fingers Taylor that was from, moved to Jackson, Mississippi. A lot of these harmonica players down there, that was really what happened, was that they got exposed to this music and they fell in love with it. And the fact that they got out of there, that says something too. If you moved out of the South by the time you were 18 years old, that's saying something.
Right.
There must be something about it you weren't that crazy about. So that's kind of the way I approach it. But I also got to say, I mean, I'd been going to the South, like I say, since 1986. And when I first started going down there, I mean, we had... my drummer was a guy named June Core, who's still around here, and I still play with him all the time. And June's a black man, and I remember he used to stay in the van when we'd go into a fast food restaurant.
In the 80s?
In the 80s.
Wow.
And now he was a vegetarian, so maybe part of it is he figured he couldn't find anything to eat at those places. But nonetheless, there was just, I can't help thinking that if you're black and you're in the South and you're with a bunch of white guys, it kind of creates a certain
and even if he was
weird
a vegetarian,
vibe.
I mean, even if he was a vegetarian, he wasn't comfortable.
I don't want to speak for him because June's still around and he can speak for himself.
But for folks that grew up in that era, in that time, it's part of their DNA of how you function in the world. It's just.
I just think that if you're at all sensitive to vibes, you pick up vibes. And there's certain things that are going to make somebody feel uncomfortable. Like I say, that one time in a bar in I think it was Oxford, Mississippi, and some guy came up and tried to compliment me with using the N-word, and it's like it just blew me away.
Right.
I was like, what the hell is this, man?
Yeah.
And it was like that was his way of complimenting me.
Huh.
So, I mean, there's a whole different kind of ball game going on with the way people were back then. And the difference is, the difference is now that young people have a much different attitude about race than they did back then. And there's not as many young people that are getting taught, that blacks and whites are different. Mm-hmm. That's like an old time thing. It's kind of something of the past. And the only way it's going to be done away with is when, young people stop adhering to that old way of thinking.
Right.
And I mean, I was fortunate because the way I grew up was I grew up with parents that, my father was the minister, of a Methodist church in the projects. So I was going to church with black kids and I was the only white kid around, or I was going to school with Mexican kids. I was, one of the only white kids there. So I was kind of in the opposite sort of situation that most white kids were growing up with, being surrounded by all white kids. They weren't being surrounded by, so, I mean, the awful thing was, if you were, say, black and you went to the school I went to, it was all Mexican kids, and at the time the Mexicans were kind of jealous of the blacks getting so much attention back then in the mid-'60s. So, there was just a lot of complexity racially, but, the bottom line is I didn't grow up in a way that I think most people did, and that I like to think that gave me a different viewpoint. We had black babysitters when I was, a toddler, and they'd play R&B on the radio, and so, I mean, the first music I heard, I remember it wasn't until years later I realized I'd heard Jimmy Reed and Slim Harpo on the radio when I was like probably 8 years old, and I didn't recognize it as blues because it was just black music to me.
Just music, yeah. Yeah. So how does, coming back around to James Harman, he comes out of Mississippi.
Oh, he came out of Alabama.
And then he moves, and you come across him. How and what was his influence on you?
Well, I kind of accidentally stumbled on Harman because in 1971 I'd been playing harmonica for about a year, and I went to a concert at a place called Rio Hondo College in Whittier, and there was a band opening the show called the Ice House Blues Band, and I didn't know this until years later when Harman told me this. It was James singing and playing harp, a guy I know named Buddy Reed who played with me much later on guitar, who also played in a band called Bacon Fat. So I saw these guys and I thought, wow, these guys kind of remind me of Canned Heat, sort of, They're like a junior version of Canned Heat, because they had long hair and they had beards and they were doing boogie and slide guitar, and, they had just kind of a rock blues thing going at the time. And then there was a band called Bertha that played on the bill as well, that was this all-woman rock band that was, had a very attractive bass player. That's all I remember.
Some things you remember.
Yeah, certain things I remember.
Things you always remember.
They were much prettier than Harman and Buddy.
What kind of bass was she playing?
She was playing the kind that fits right in a good spot.
But you don't know if it was a Fender.
Probably a Fender P bass. I don't know.
Yeah, but you weren't paying attention to that.
I was not. So that was the first time I saw James, and it wasn't until the 80s that I saw him again, and that was when he came up to the Bay Area. I think that's when I first met James in about 1984. He played a club called the Last Day Saloon in San Francisco. Mm-hmm. And he had this great band with Hollywood Fats on guitar and Kid Ramos on guitar and Willie J on bass and Hodges on a big, 36-inch bass drum or something. And he had this great big kick drum that said "Those Dangerous Gentlemen's"
very
on
nice.
it. And so that was the first time I saw those guys, but it was really not until about a year later that I saw them do a gig at Larry Blake's that they just really knocked my socks off, because they were, the guitars were really firing on all cylinders, and James was putting on a great show. It was a packed house, and the band rocked. And that was when I realized how great these guys were. And I'd known Hollywood Fats from way before that, because he used to play, when I first got into blues in the early 70s, he was playing around. he was playing, I saw him do a show with, I think it was Pee Wee Crayton and Big Joe Turner and Cleanhead Vincent or somebody like that, and he was backing them up. I saw him with the Jimmy Witherspoon. I saw him with his own band, the Hollywood Fats Band, at least a couple times. So, I had seen him play, but with the Harman Band, it was really on fire.
So did he do the traditional go to Chicago and then come west, or how did he end up here?
Well, Harman ended up here, and I found this, Harman used to always tell me, he'd say, yeah, well, the Bear told me to move out here from Canned Heat, Bob Haidt, and so Fido, the drummer, Fido de la Parra, called me up day before yesterday and asked about Harman, and I've known Fido for a while, and he just said, what happened? And I told him what happened, and he said, I remember him so well from way back then. He goes, because he used to come over and hang out at the Bears house all the time, and we'd sit around, we'd listen to blues records, and I think that was how Harman got into, because Bob Haidt, the Bear, had the second or first biggest collection of 78s in either the country or the world. I think it was in the world. He had one of the biggest collection of old 78s of country blues. And so Harman got into the same thing. And the deal with the Bear was he was really into the old 78s by the guys from the 20s and 30s and 40s. So if something was really, rare and hard to find, he'd find a copy of it. And he'd have multiple copies. And a lot of times, Harman was doing the same sort of thing. And so one of the things about James that I noticed after getting to know him longer was how steeped in this old style of blues he was, which was the country blues, and that a lot of his songs kind of were reminiscent of some of these older artists like, P.D. Wheatstraw or Big Bill Brunzi or Brownie McGee or different people like that. And so I started noticing that more and more in his music, that just, Sonny Terry was a definite influence on harmonica of his. Sonny Boy Williamson, Rice Miller was an influence. John Lee, Sonny Boy Williamson I was an influence. Jazz Gillum, all these old guys. But, also people like Big Walter Horton and Little Walter. You kind of couldn't help be influenced by all of these guys. But he really had a connection to the country blues stuff, and that really ended up in his music.
Well, how about we listen to a James Harman song?
Okay.
What do you suggest?
I'd say this is one I heard on my iPod about a month or two ago that I've had, this is from the first harmonica blowout. This is from the Blues Harp Meltdown Mountaintop 2000. It's a 2-disc set. And this is one called Backdoor Rumba. And this is really James on fire on this one.
Okay, Backdoor Rumba. Here we go.
on, baby. Wasn't that you last night, darling? Back scratching at the door. I know it's you, little girl, 'cause you scratch it like you done before. You calling out to me, baby, daddy, 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 let me in. Oh, hollering out, baby, hollering, daddy, daddy, let me in. So now, baby, you got a thing going, darling, darling, since I bought you that new chair. I'm gonna worry about it, baby, not worry all night again. I went to worry about it, baby, and I worried all night again. Yes, I did. I know you don't love me, you just want me to be your loving friend. It take a little pretty baby, and it take a little bring me down. It take a little girl to bring me down. I'm gonna worry about it, baby, hoping I ain't your loving clown. You got me sitting there thinking, baby, not thought about the thing that you done before. You got me worried, little girl, but you gonna come back shaking at my door, little girl, little girl. Got me worried once again, yes you do. Oh, got me worried, baby, what in the world I'm supposed to do? Tell me about it, man.
All right, so that was James Harman doing Backdoor Rumba. That's off the Blues Harp Meltdown CD that's got an incredible lineup of players. Kim Wilson, Billy Branch, Rick Estrin, James Harman, myself, Gary Smith, that's Junior Watson on the guitar right there. RJ Michaud's on harmonica on this. It's a double disc, and we've actually got 4 different harmonica meltdowns. James is also on this Electrify one. This one is called Still Here and Gone. And by the way, Electrify Records sponsors our podcast today, as does Seidel Harmonicas, as does Mountaintop Records, who Mountaintop produced my book, Big Road Blues, 12 Bars on I-80. All about road stories, including a couple about Harman in there. But what I wanted to mention, one more thing before we go, is that James incorporated this country blues styling into his later stuff. It kind of really came into his music later in life. You know, the older he got, it seemed like that kind of early influence seemed to creep in there the last, say, 15, 20 years of his recording. And he did an album for Electrify Records that I love. He did 2 albums for this label that sponsored Andrew Galloway, who is sponsoring the show, recorded this one called Fine Print. That's a really great album. And also one called Bone Time. And these are both really great James Harman records that he released in the last few years. What year was this? 2018. And the one I was thinking you could play on this was one I talked to my friend Charlie Lang that used to book James, and I mentioned I was going to play a cut on here, and he goes, "Oh man, you got to play Memory Foam Mattress."
Oh, Memory
because
Foam.
This has really got the country blues influence in it, but it also is just such a great example of James and the way he could come up with these lyrics. It's like Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan could come up with lyrics that were like a little movie, and James could do the same thing on his songwriting. This guy wrote a song a day for the last 15 years. He's got something like 16 albums worth of songs that have not been recorded. So he was just a prolific writer. He was just an amazing entertainer because he was funny as all get out. I mean, I could tell you so many great stories about his just, the things he would say. And one of the ones I actually just texted Charlie Musselwhite and said, give me some good Harman stories. And he mentioned one because another guy that passed away was just in the last month was Paul Osher, who used to play with Muddy Waters. And James said the first time that he met Paul, it was when Muddy Waters was playing at, I think it was at the Troubadour in Los Angeles. And he said Muddy got up there and played, and Paul Osher was the harmonica player. He was the first white harmonica player in Muddy's band. Again, the same thing that we're talking about. It was a rare thing back then. And so Harman and Rod Piazza and Johnny Dyer, who was another character, George Harmonica Smith, who was one of the really famous harmonica players in Los Angeles, they all went to the show, and Charlie Musselwhite was sitting there at a table, and Muddy calls him up, and of course Osher, being the troublemaker he was, as soon as Muddy called up Charlie, Osher just takes all the knobs on the amp and just twists them all over, so Charlie would get nothing but feedback, and Charlie kind of, what the hell was that? And gets really pissed off, so Osher comes up afterwards and tries to talk to Charlie, and Charlie grabs him by the tie and pulls him down into the table and goes, "Don't ever do that again." Wow.
And did he? Did he do it again?
No, I'm sure he didn't. So after that, Paul was pissed off the rest of the gig, and so these guys are hanging outside like Harman and Rod and Johnny Dyer and George Smith are all hanging against the car, just shooting the breeze, and I guess Paul Osher's in a bad mood and he wants to take it out on somebody. He hears Harman's voice and his southern accent and goes, "Hey, I saw you. Yeah, you're gonna throw that empty beer mug at me." And George Smith intervenes and goes, "No, you're mistaken, Paul." He goes, "Paul, James never has an empty beer mug." And that broke the ice,
So let's go out. Let's play Memory Foam Mattress, and when we come back, Mark's going to play a couple tunes for you.
Memory Foam Mattress. I'm gonna sell a memory foam mattress, baby. Holds too many memories of you. It reminds me of our golden years. Before you said you was through, you swore on your mama's Bible that forever you'd be true. But you traded the devil your last breath to live forever, making me blue. I put your crushed velvet lazy boy in the dumpster out behind the mall. Folded up your TV dinner tray and tucked it neatly out in the hall. I saw your pink princess telephone in the yard sale just yesterday. You won't be calling that fella no more to tell him you on your way. I cashed in all those bottles you had blocking my garage. My troubles all disappearing now, like they've been a damn mirage. When that insurance check finally comes in, I'll create you a little shrine, and I'll be smiling at it every morning, knowing you're in hell and doing fine. Oh yeah. Now the devil drives a hard bargain, as devils often will. He wanted a little something extra to sweeten your deal's bitter pill. old devil was not satisfied about the deal you forced on him. So he helped me with my dirty work. He told me, you want me to handle this for you, Jim? That's as good as that's going to get.
All right, before I do this next song, I'd like to give it a little intro because I wrote this song back in 1986, the first time I went over to Europe. And two of the guys that I'd played in the band with were both sick with cancer. One of them, Johnny Waters, had cancer, and my friend Sonny Lane had Lou Gehrig's disease. And I remember it was the first time I went to Europe, so I had horrible jet lag on top of that, and I couldn't sleep, and these guys were on my mind, just their situation. And they died probably the following year, but it definitely did a number on me, and I wrote this song called Rollin' From Side to Side back then. And it seems like over the last few years, with all these people that I've known in the blues passing away, it keeps bringing this song back. How many people have gone on to the other side that I've known. So I'm going to do this one for James Harman right now. Laid down last night, people, I was rolling from side to side. Laid down last night, people, I was rolling from side to side. No matter what I did, people, I just couldn't close my eyes. My stomach was churning, people, just like a hurricane. My stomach was churning, people, just like a hurricane. All these worried thoughts was swimming all through my brain. I was thinking about my friends that are so far away. I was thinking about my friends that are so far away. You know it's out of my hands, baby. All I can do is to pray. Someday, baby, you know I'm going to take my rest. Someday, baby, people, I'm going to take my rest. You know my mind is rambling. People like the wild geese out in the west.
Excellent.
Is that all right?
That's great.